deployments and over 6 years of experience in joint assignments. As a battalion commander in 2003, he led more than 1,200 soldiers as part of the 3rd Infantry Division's ground assault to liberate Baghdad. And since 2003, he spent more than 40 months deployed to the U.S. Central Command. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome General Stephen Lyons.
Yeah, thank you. I was in the back chatting with Jack, just catching up. And hey, well, thanks. And I got General Ashley out here. Is he off doing something? Hey, I appreciate the invite from DIA. And I was, as I was reading, as I was doing my IPB, just a little bit late coming down on the plane this morning, I realized how tech intensive this is. And I realized how tech intensive I'm not. So maybe it's a perfect match. You probably, the invitation probably needed to go to my CIO, Rob Lyman, who just happened to be on leave, so it's your unlucky day. But I'm happy to be here and I'm happy to talk to you. What I'd like to do actually is probably, after that CIO panel, which I understand was phenomenal, take you back up probably to about 40,000. And then at the end, I'm going to come back to, if you got in the Q&A session anyway, I'll save a little bit of time to talk about what Transcom is doing with regard to data, big data, cloud, and some of our IT optimization initiatives, which are critical to our defense transportation enterprise. So you can appreciate that we are a data-intensive organization, and we see it very similar to the intelligence community that data is central to our ability to succeed in bringing and leveraging computing technology, right, and being able to move beyond advanced analytics to machine learning and AI and these types of technologies. Well, let me first kind of give you a perspective, I guess, from a geographic, a global, I should say, COCOM commander with functional responsibilities. And what I believe the NDS does for all of us, but specifically, I think, in the terms of strategic logistics, which has significant implications for our ability to project power, and I think it has significant implications for the intelligence community to collect on a much broader scale. So if you could put the first slide up. So I'm not going to go back through the strategy with you. I would only say that as you look at the strategy and you look at great power competition, and if you look at the range from day-to-day competition to our need and ability to scale up to the very high end of respond, and you think about an environment, right, that forces us to project power at the end of very long and contested lines of communication across all domains. That's a pretty dramatic game changer in challenging the assumptions that we've made in previous times about how we've done deliberate planning and how we've assumed we were going to operate over time. And so if you go to the next slide, you won't be surprised, I don't think, by any of these missions for this combatant command called Transcom. It's emerging just like the missions of DIA and every other organization. When we started in 1987, we were an organization that was break glass only in the time of war. And then you can see the emergence over the arc of missions as we assume them, whether that be Global Manager for Transportation, aerial medical evacuation, or the assumption of the Joint Enabling Command when JFCOM stood down. But what I really wanted to point out to you is a relatively new mission in the latest UCP, which is the Joint Deployment and Distribution Coordinator, which gives the Transcom commander not necessarily directive authority, but a coordinating authority to bring the broader community together to look holistically about our ability to project power and sustain combat power, right, a global scale, time and place of our choosing, and then look at that from a warfighting perspective and identify gaps and seams for the Secretary as we move forward against a new security environment. So next slide, if you would. If there was really only 3 things that I could leave an audience like this would probably summarize the 3 things that I would leave you with. So I think you can appreciate, and I don't have to argue with anybody in here, our ability to project power at transoceanic distances is a distinct strategic comparative advantage. Matter of fact, I would argue to you that, and you as intelligence professionals know this better than I, as great power adversaries look at the United States of America, what they really admire most, right, is our ability to globally command and control this incredible network of allies and partners that we have across the globe, and then our ability to project power on a global scale. So you can appreciate that 85% of the joint force resides in the continental United States and must be moved to its point of employment. The second thing I mentioned already really is this emerging environment that we're really living in now, I would argue, at least in the contested phase, but what that might look like against a high-end adversary. And the strategy, I think, lays this out quite nicely, but creates some challenges for us as we look at our ability to project power over time against a higher peer or near-peer competitor in the environment that we look at today. And then the third thing that I would leave you with is probably something that may not be broadly understood, is the inextricable link with commercial industry and our commercial industry providers in terms of transportation capacity, and also in terms of our interfaces with other interagency partners that facilitate our ability to project power. Largely across a unclassified domain, and largely one that transcends .mil to .com and .gov and other interagency providers. It presents, you might appreciate, a very large and complex attack surface. On the other hand, we don't have to defend everything all the time. And there's a kind of an approach, right, on how you approach the triage and how you approach resiliency and how you're interconnected with the geographic combatant commands on how you create the conditions to be able to continue to project power well into the future as a comparative advantage. So if you go to the next slide, what I would describe to you here is what I call kind of the warfighting framework. Now, we were pretty limited on time today. I didn't bring a big HUA video and all that kind of stuff, so you can see ships and trains and rail cars and all that kind of stuff being loaded. But it's a great day. It's a great, it's a great day to be the Transcom commander. I'll confess to you that. But what I would say in terms of a warfighting framework, right, the real power of the Transcom enterprise and our ability to shift east, right, to CENTCOM or EUCOM, ability to shift west into PACOM, or adjacent, Southcom or here in the continental United States with Northcom, is really this global posture that we have day to day. And I tell my fellow combatant commanders, unlike many of them, I actually have all the authorities that I need as a Transcom commander to operate day in and day out. And I also have the preponderance of mobility forces assigned to the combatant command U.S. Transcom. So it's very rare that I have to ask for authorities. In the case where a geographic combatant commander comes to the table and says, I need a force opening package or something to enable an opening of an airfield, I can do that under my own authorities. I can robust the network, shrink the network, and operate inside that network. That gives us an incredible amount of flexibility. But that network is predicated upon a strong relationship with allies and partners that essentially expand our logistics network for us, as well as predicated upon reliance on commercial, what you might think of as global trade routes day in and day out. And that offers such a great opportunity and there's so much moving in a day-to-day basis, it's very complicated. It's kind of like a needle in a needle stack sometimes. And we watch very closely to see if our high-end adversaries and their reflection as to whether they're able to distinguish between what's moving of significant priority and what's moving as a matter of routine. As you think about machine learning and AI and those kinds of things, and you think about the amount of data that's out there in the system and our ability to see that more clearly, you can see potential in this area. So the global network is fundamentally foundational to everything we do. Secondarily, I would say, is the mobility capacity. So whether that's airlift, aerial refuel, sea lift, whether it's your power projection platforms linked to your seaports of embarkation, but things do have to move and there are physics involved in that process. And then the third thing, I would argue that from a functional global combatant command perspective, this construct of globally integrated operations and global command and control, I would argue, is a center of gravity that allows us, right, to optimize a network of scarce resources against the Secretary and the Chairman's priorities. And so in terms of a framework, that's kind of how we view. Now in terms of the intelligence enterprise, and I know my J2's out here somewhere, I haven't been able to pick him out yet. There he is right there. So Henry, thanks for being here today. So for him, and he's a phenomenal J2. I got a great support by our agency reps, national agency reps. Got a great J2, but you can imagine the collection effort against the complicated framework that I just laid out there, and I'll come back to that momentarily. If you go to the next slide, please. So what's going on today? You know, you could say we're not in phase 1 operations. You could say we're beyond that, particularly in CENTCOM, AFRICOM, active areas of hostility. But as you look at what's going on today in the realm of competition, it's pretty clear in my own view that our adversaries, particularly our high-end adversaries, understand that our ability to project power transoceanic distances is a comparative advantage. One that they'd very much like to dismantle, deny, degrade well before they would have to fight the pointy end of the spear. There's no question about that. And so we see very deliberate activities on the part of adversaries through cyber and cyber reconnaissance. Some of these are been unclassified, declassified, and actually released. Frankly, if you look back to the GDSS compromise by China about 2004, 2005 timeframe, and you look at the way the Chinese came after that system, not through the front door, but through the back door, software development, and not necessarily just through the code, but through the data and the data structure. This is fundamental, right, as you think about what potentially could happen down the road, not just about the disruption of your IT systems, but falsifying information in those IT systems, the level of confidence that you may have. So we're pressing very, very hard at Transcom on cyber mission assurance in a number of areas. And I can talk about that in the Q&A if you'd like me to. You're well aware of the rest, intellectual property theft, infiltration and acquisition value chains, very interesting. Foreign investments and the real competition, right, for allies and partners. It's an ongoing competitive war every day. And what we see with our adversaries is they don't have the same bifurcation in the way they think about business system or institutional design systems as we do. We tend to separate tactical, operational, strategic, institutional. Our adversaries see this holistically, and are willing to use all instruments of power, economic, state-owned enterprise, et cetera, to position themselves in a position of advantage, potentially in a position that could potentially degrade or deny our ability to project power. So you can definitely appreciate that, I think, in this community and the level of collection. Now, from my own perspective, our J2, which is a phenomenal organization, has always focused predominantly on the geospatial aspect of intelligence collection, right? Critical nodes, ports, et cetera, et cetera. This is a complex and expanding collection effort as to how we understand what our adversary knows and understands about this enterprise, how that presents opportunities for us, and you might be able to think about that, right? And how we can counter and present dilemmas for an adversary. And so the next slide, I think, is the last slide, and I'll leave you with this, and I'll go to Q&A because I got a little bit of time. But this, I think, really frames, in my own view, and the J2 put this together. If you think about the warfighting framework, I got a global posture, I got global capacity in terms of transportation, think of onboard platforms, and I've got global command and control, right? And you can think in the level of competition that I just talked about today, all the way through the scale up of a fully mobilized enterprise where we're responding to crisis with a surge force, and the level of challenge to collect. We are oriented, for the most part, on the far right side where the red is. That's our comfort zone. I get great reports on the latest surface-to-air weapon system, for example. But on the left side, in this gray zone, in this competition, very, very complex, very difficult, very ambiguous, and it's far more difficult to understand. But I would argue to you that that's where we set the conditions for success or failure as we go forward. And I think that's it. I think there's, if you go to the next slide, please. So I'll stop there. I left about 8 minutes for Q&A. I really wanted to leave a little bit of time for Q&A, and I'll go wherever you want to go. As long as you don't ask me a tough IT question. I would say to you, though, that one of the things that underscores this enterprise is the enormous amount of logistics data, services, DLA, this combatant command, et cetera, They're all distinct, deaggregated. It's an infrastructure that we inherited over time. And it's not without its challenges, as you can imagine. So we've taken on some big data kinds of initiatives. We've got an enterprise data environment that we're working with, some use cases that we're developing, and really with the intent of moving from where we are today, which is largely unstructured transactional kinds of data, to how do we move to an environment, a structure to include the cloud that allows us to leverage and harness this big data environment that we have that we just can't quite get our arms around to leverage the advanced computing power that's already there today, but that we're struggling with a little bit. Okay. Any questions from the audience? I think I might be the last one before lunch. So, yeah. Yeah, you have to give them the mic. Thank you.
I apologize. Yes, sir, do you see our rules of engagement adapting as we increase threats to U.S. assets and joint assets in the Central Theory?
To be honest with you, I would say only partially. I think there's a much higher level of appreciation and awareness. But when you start to get into these discussions about all instruments of power, you can't help but to get into a broader discussion about all aspects of government. It's a very, very challenging aspect of a democracy, right? On how you harness all aspects of government to focus on an adversary that's kind of in this low level of competitive space that not everybody appreciates and sees the same way that we do. So I think on the military side, I think the answer is yes, but I think in other areas, we still have a long way to go, although you can see some momentum that's shifting. Thanks for the question.
Sir, how concerned are you with like the Internet of Things? I mean, now we pay tolls via RFID signal. Shipping containers contain RFID signals for tracking. Everything is now electronic in the cloud and things like that. Have you shifted a lot of your security concerns to address areas like that?
Yeah, no, it's a fair question. So there's kind of two dimensions to this. Again, I kind of alluded, this is a fairly large attack surface. We're not exactly the quietest enterprise around. That creates, in some ways, that creates opportunities, though. There's so much out there that even, frankly, I find our own Blue Force has a difficult time really understanding what's going on. In fact, I've asked the guys to put a red team together to really kind of take a look and see, hey, what can you really tell, open source and other sources about what's going on? So it's kind of like a needle and needle stack sometimes. That presents us some opportunities. I think as we go forward, though, to get to your point, I do think that we've got to balance this tension between how we move, particularly in the unclassified domains that we operate in, to an environment that presents a level of security that's far greater than exists today. And I think we're moving in that direction, but that's not a direction you get to overnight. We've migrated, I think, 5 or 6 systems to the cloud. We've got a plan to kind of move in that direction, but security, and there's a couple different options on whether we want to invest in an enterprise off-the-shelf system and what that might bring or might not bring. So there's an operational piece of this, which is my first and foremost priority, and then there's kind of the how do you run the business, and we've got to look at it holistically about what does that mean to vulnerabilities and potential security vulnerabilities. So, you know, that's kind of not a direct answer to your question because it's a fairly challenging situation as I look at it. But I don't think it's dire, I guess, is my answer back to you. In other words, we don't have to protect everything 24/7. We have to know what we have to protect, though, our critical information. Yes, ma'am.
Sir, with your global mission, Transcom, can you talk a little bit about your interoperability challenges with our allies?
Yeah, it's a great question. The question was, given the global mission, would I talk about the interoperability with our allies and partners? You know, it's interesting if you look at an alliance like NATO or frankly other allies and alliances we have and treaties out there. We do not predicate those on, you know, there's many other areas of interoperability. In the area of logistics, it's often the approach that, you know, costs kind of lie where they fall kind of an approach. And inherently either a service or in this case a nation, a state, you know, the United States is responsible for logistics. Now, what that creates for us is when we show up, invariably we're going to have to provide support to allies and partners that we want to bring on the team, and we recognize that. But it's not in the fashion of an interoperability, technical interoperability perspective. There's a couple examples working out there in Europe, things like Atari's where there's an exchange, but on scale, you know, in the scope of things that I'm willing to go after, that's kind of like way out there, kind of like boil the ocean kind of activity. I'm trying to get to the things that we can get to in the near term. It's a great question though, and I recognize that we're going to have to support our allies and partners, but we don't, in our planning for force sizing and sufficiency or interoperability, we don't necessarily design in that kind of a fashion. So that's a fair question. Thanks.
Sir?
Yes, sir. I think you got the last one.
With Transcom's requirement to partner with industry, with the continued investment by foreign nations in private industry, what are some of the risk management or supply chain risk concerns that you might have as those foreign adversaries continue to invest in these private industries that you may need to utilize?
Well, that's a fantastic question. We pay a lot of attention to that, and this whole piece I was talking about of how well do we understand the market, how well do we understand business intelligence. So I'll use an example for you, and I think the Navy War College kind of wrote a report on this last year that I think really captured the essence of the issue. And when the sea lift industry reorganized, when it was really in a downturn a couple years ago and reorganized and came out, right, with 3 major alliances, one of those alliances was led by a French company, CGM I think is the name of the company, right? And their alliance is with COSCO Shipping, China. And COSCO Shipping, as you can appreciate, right, is the leading state-owned enterprise for China that's buying up all the ports globally, owns all the sea lift, include the sea lift that'll support PLA activities, et cetera, and also has an alliance with a company called APL, which is one of our U.S. flagged companies. So, you know, I engaged the CEO directly on this, and the question was, what does that kind of an alliance mean? Because you have to recognize that our traders have to trade with Asia Pacific, right? I mean, that's the vast majority of the trade. And but what does that really mean in terms of data sharing and their level of understanding? And right now, it's a pretty clear bifurcation and a pretty clear distinction. But it's something that we watch pretty closely because we're not only competing for allies and partners, we're also competing for business partners that we're going to count on, right, that fly the U.S. flag, that we, particularly in the sea lift side, more so than the airlift side. Airlift's a little bit different. So it's a great question. We spend a fair amount of time focused on that level of market intelligence. We also have a vendor vetting cell. It's probably, I think it's only one of 2 that are in the department. CENTCOM has one focused on their CENTCOM theater operations. But we have one that Captain Stevenson runs, and he looks inside the subcontracting networks to make sure that our primes are doing business with the folks that we want to do business with. And we found a few that we didn't want, and now we got to kind of work that through the broader acquisition community. But great question. My time went to red, and so you got the last question. I appreciate it very much. And let me just say to the community at large, though, really impressive audience. As I looked at the schedule and the agenda, boy, I could see you could get a lot out of this. So thanks for what you're doing, and thanks for your commitment, and thanks for your support. We get great support from the intelligence enterprise, and the work that you're doing to really harness data and to figure out how to leverage the computing technology that's out there is really significant, I think, as a warfighting multiplier. So thanks for what you're doing, and take care. Thanks, Jack. Take care.